Y'all know we're always going to hype our local theater scene, but sometimes we know people want to get away. That's why if you're headed to the Northeast, I'm going to put y'all on to the Williamstown Theater Festival this summer. From July 17th to August 3rd, among the Berkshire Mountains in northwestern Massachusetts, over 130 artists will take the stage for nearly 100 performances. Some of the offerings include a world premiere from Jeremy O'Harris, a production of Camino Reels starring Pamela Anderson and Nicholas Alexander Chavez, and a new adaptation of a Samuel Barber opera. Discounted hotel rooms are available through June 1st. Go to WTFestival.org and make your plans to immerse yourself in theater this summer. Today on CityCast Chicago, lawmakers finally unveil reform plans for Metra, CTA, and more regional transit agencies, but is it enough? Plus, we dive into gun violence prevention efforts on the West Side and have even more events for your calendar this upcoming June. It's Friday, May 30th. I'm Jacoby Cochran, and this is what Chicago's talking about. Morning, my friends. Joining me today from Southside Weekly Investigations editor Jim Daly. Jim, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, Jacoby. Good to be here.
Always good time, my friend. And from WTTW, host and correspondent Nick Blumberg. Nick, welcome to the podcast.
Morning. Thanks for having me.
And for everybody listening, whether it's on 2x speed, whether you're catching us on Friday early in the morning or whenever you catch up, we appreciate you being here. If this is the only episode you've listened to this week, then you've missed some good ones. I understand it's been a shortened week for a lot of us, but please go back. We talked about the city council's push to install a SNAP curfew for young people. We visited farmers markets across the land. And yesterday, we talked about all the things we are excited for in June. But with this being our last episode of the month, I also want you to dig back through the crates of May, where we visited a garden and I got to meet hundreds and hundreds of bees. We talked vintage stores, alleys, Chicago sky, and so much more. Nick, what is something you are excited for with June right here in front of us? We almost halfway through the year, y'all. What you excited for this month?
I am excited about the sun being up after 8 p.m. I wish I could remember who it was, but somebody tweeted, like, I like to think I'm a complex person with all these important thoughts. And then the sun is out and I am happy. I am basically just a giant leaf. And I really felt that in my soul.
100%. I will say, though, this morning I opened my eyes at like 5:50 or 5:45, and it was the brightest that it has been at that time, obviously, in months and months. I wasn't ready for it. I might have to close these blinds a little bit more. That one kind of caught me off guard. But I do love finishing like work at the end of the day and still having 2, 3, maybe even 4 hours of prime sunshine.
Yeah, there's nothing like finishing dinner and sitting out on the back porch and just getting to be like, wow, we got like another hour of this, you guys.
Jim, what about you? We all excited for the sunshine. What's something you're looking forward to this month?
I'm looking forward to that sunshine finally warming up Chicago so that we can go to the beach. I've been looking forward to the beach all spring. Hopefully we can go in June. Probably won't be able to get into the water, but that's okay. By July, it should be warm enough to dip a toe, I think. And then August, we can go swimming. And so we'll get a few weeks sooner or later.
Luckily, in our guide to June, we gave people the dates that not only the beaches are going to be open, but we talked about outdoor pools around Chicago opening on June 21st. And so hopefully by the time folks are getting into the water, if they aren't already, because I know some people out there was polar plunging, still already out there on the beaches. Not me yet. I ain't dipped my toe even in the community pool right by me yet. And so soon enough, though, I think this might be the weekend where maybe I hop in the pool.
Okay, that sounds great.
Get your wetsuit ready.
Yeah.
One thing I am excited for that I didn't talk about in our guide is Black Yacht Weekend. That's Juneteenth weekend. I do appreciate the energy it brings to the city, the after parties that weekend. Just have a few more people in them from out of town. And when Black folks come to Chicago, they celebrate this city in such a beautiful way that I particularly appreciate. And so that's something that I also want to add. But people, go back through our guide to June that we dropped on Thursday, and you can get all of our recommendations and write them down. Every single Friday, we bring in these amazing journalists and these friends from across Chicago to talk about some of the big stories happening in our week. And Nick, I'm going to start with you because legislators have been in Springfield since January, since the start of the year, with some major things on their agenda. Just a few for people to remind you. $3 billion budget gap, preparing the state for federal funding cuts, providing solutions for regional transit agencies who are facing, let's just call it a disastrous budget shortfall. However, back in January, there were no clear signs that lawmakers were prepared to tackle the transit issues and have been frankly tight-lipped on the subject over the last couple of months, even as agencies have been sounding the alarm, releasing their doomsday scenarios of 40% service cuts, layoffs, suspension of train and bus lines. Now, with literally just days left in the spring session, a transit reform and some separate funding bills have finally been revealed. Nick, what is in this transit reform bill? And also, what is the outlook on funding?
They packed a whole lot in there, as they love to do, and give us not a lot of time to really go in and parse it. But that's part of the fun of the General Assembly. So on the governance side, this is something lawmakers have been really clear about. There is not going to be any extra funding to meet that $770 million budget gap projected for next year without some big reforms to the way transit is run. You've got the RTA that sort of oversees all the different transit agencies, CTA, Metra, PACE. And they came out and said, listen, we've done a lot of work to coordinate over the years. We take this seriously. We want to make this work. The real thing that's holding us back is funding. Frankly, lawmakers weren't particularly receptive to that. So they've been in conversations behind closed doors for months now. They had, hours and hours and hours of public hearings last year talking about this. But really, they've been in some pretty intense negotiations to try to figure out a deal that everybody can agree on. There are a lot of people in the room. There's lawmakers, there's folks from Pritzker administration, there's labor unions, there's transit advocates. So what they finally came up with is a plan to essentially replace the RTA with the new Northern Illinois Transit Authority. The idea is that they're going to oversee things at a regional level. They're going to be way more empowered than the current RTA. So they're going to make sure there's a universal fare system. They're going to make sure that schedules are coordinated. They're going to plan these big capital projects like, overhauling a transit station or building a new rail line, those sorts of big infrastructure things. They're going to look at those from a regional level. They're going to make sure that, for example, if you take a Metra train to a station, you won't see a PACE bus that just pulled out a minute ago going down the street away from you and you're waiting 40 minutes for the next one. So the idea here, they call it a one network, one timetable, one ticket model. And basically CTA, Metra, and PACE, they're still going to exist, but they're going to be basically operational divisions. Should this pass, they're basically going to be operational divisions focusing on running buses and trains, kind of the core of their mission. But they're not going to be doing as much of the coming up with these big capital ideas and going after funding or coming up with their own ticketing system or policy.
So you talk about universal fare. Is that meaning Metra prices come to CTA levels or CTA prices come to Metra? Or would there be an across, I imagine, months and years, just an overall change of the fare system?
They've got language in the bill that says there needs to be a universal ticket. Now, in terms of what the actual fare policy is, because this is such a complex change, because all these different systems that they have to figure out how the heck they're going to work together, they gave themselves some runway. So there's going to be a working group that gets seated by April of next year. And then they have all sorts of deadlines within the bill for, by 2027, you have to have this in place. By 2028, you have to have this in place. By all these different changes, instead of just saying, okay, y'all go figure this out, have fun. They're going to have people who, really have expertise in this, who have, some skin in the game to sit down and say, okay, what makes sense for us? What are the policies we need to put in place? And what's a reasonable time frame to do them? So there are a lot of details that are going to get worked out once that group gets seated by next spring.
There was a lot of talk throughout this process from the heads of regional transit organizations about not wanting to lose power. As this bill is currently written, do they lose that type of authority that they've long held?
There are definitely going to be some big changes. Yeah. I mean, what CTA, Metro, and Pace can do right now, the way this bill reads, that's going to be curtailed. They're going to have their responsibilities more limited to running buses, running trains, making sure they've got adequate staff, making sure that the trains are cleaned and kept up and things like that. So this is going to be a pretty significant change. They've been very consistent that the issue is funding, is not governance. And to some extent, that's true. The state of Illinois provides far less public funding to transit systems than a lot of peer agencies. They've also been kind of hung up by this fact that by law, about 50% of their operating money has to come from passenger fares. Now, that's a way higher ratio than in other places as well. And that is one thing that this tackles. That benchmark initially goes down to 25%. So that's also going to make some of the funding issues less stark for the transit agencies.
Another part of this bill is a measure to develop a independent police force by 2028. Can you talk a little bit about that?
That's right. I mean, and this is something that a lot of folks have called for, particularly lawmakers have. I think they hear a lot from their constituents about safety, or in some instances, the perception of safety on public transit, because the actual reported crime numbers have been going down. But if people don't feel like they're safe, they're not going to ride. So in some ways, perception is reality there. Lawmakers have been really clear that that's something that needs to get addressed. So yes, there's going to be a report due by 2028 looking at how do we create a dedicated transit police force. There's also sort of a provision in there to create a law enforcement task force of relevant agencies kind of within the region to look at some of the safety issues, in the nearer term. And there's also a transit ambassadors program, which is kind of a non-police option that a lot of transit advocates and passengers have wanted to see. It can be both sort of a customer service thing. It's like someone's in from out of town and they're like, red line toward Howard means I'm going north or south, like where, help, please. So they can kind of be a presence on the system and help people navigate. They can help with customer service issues, but also just having kind of that non-police presence, but visible presence throughout the system is something that a lot of folks think is a really good way to ensure like the rider experience is comfortable, is safe, and can discourage some of the conduct that people hate to see. Stuff, that's not necessarily like violent crime, but stuff like smoking. It's a way to sort of curtail that can negatively affect riders' experiences.
So we've talked infrastructure, but as we said, a big part that didn't come till a little later on in the evening was the funding piece in all of this. 700 million plus funding gap that, again, we talked about, if not addressed, could lead to some major service cuts across the network. How are lawmakers planning to address that?
Yeah, they've come out with a whole idea, a whole list of potential funding sources. We're talking Thursday morning, so we're going to learn some more details throughout the day. But kind of the top line is they are looking at this not just as a one-time patch. They are looking for long-term solutions, long-term revenue sources. So some of that is going to come in cost savings that they expect from this new, more regional model. But they're also looking at doing things like the charging station fee for electric vehicle charging stations, a tollway surcharge. They're looking at extending rideshare fees to the Cook County suburbs and collar counties. They're looking at taking some of that real estate transfer tax money also for Cook County suburbs and collar counties. Right now, Metra will sometimes shift its operating money to use on capital projects. This would curtail that. This would take any interest the state earns on its road fund that it uses for roads, highways. The interest on that would go toward capital projects, so some of those big infrastructure programs for transit. So there's a whole package of revenue ideas that they've put out here. This was something that was really a sticking point we heard during the negotiations about this, because revenue is always tough, and it's a tough budget year anyway, on top of having that massive funding gap that people said would put transit into a death spiral. So they really were walking and chewing gum at the same time. We'll see that the legislature is still in session until 11:59 on Saturday night, and it's going to be a big lift for them to get all this done. But transit was really, really top of mind for a lot of lawmakers.
What's the chances that it goes through as, currently written?
I'm not necessarily the best reader of tea leaves down here in Springfield, but I do think, I know there have been really, really intense negotiations with lawmakers, folks from the governor's office, advocates, labor groups. They really made an effort to get all the stakeholders at the table whose support they would need for this. I think the fact that we have seen both a governance bill and a funding bill are probably good signs. If they can get the votes on them. I think the fact that they've had such intense and ongoing negotiations means that the key stakeholders have really bought in. So in terms of every member of the House or Senate, are they necessarily read in on all the details? Maybe not, but I think there are enough legislative leaders with sway who can whip the votes that this has a pretty decent chance of getting through. And I think the fact that there are just so many eyes on this issue, it puts a lot of pressure on lawmakers to get something done. But the General Assembly can do some crazy stuff, so we will see what happens.
As Mayor Johnson rounds the block on 2 years in office and the city celebrates drops in homicides and shootings in that time, Southside Weekly has really been pulling back the layers on these initiatives to deep dive into the anti-violence organizations across the South and West sides that have been on the forefront of these efforts for decades and whose pedagogy is finally getting more resources, supports, and even pilot programs within local government. But Jim, you have recently spoken with community organizers across the city. What have you been learning?
So I spoke to block club captains, organizers, community violence interrupters, police district counselors, and elected officials to really try and get a complete picture of the efforts that Westsiders are taking to combat violence and also the root causes of violence. One of the things that Brandon Johnson has made a centerpiece of his strategy to reduce violence is to attack economic root causes with things like jobs programs, and then also to, along with the state and governor, fund these community violence intervention programs. So community violence intervention, or CVI, these are the violence interrupters that you may have heard of on the news who are out there in the streets and alleys and hospital rooms every night, talking people down from retaliating, trying to diffuse conflicts, whether they're interpersonal or tied to street economies and gang violence, and also to try to negotiate non-aggression agreements or truces between various factions. There's over 80 gang-affiliated cliques in Austin alone, for example, and so that's really tough and constant work that they're dealing with. But one of the things that all of these folks that I talked to, no matter who they were, when I asked them about the causes of violence, whether it's interpersonal or gang-related, they said that they were economic, that people need jobs, that people need to see a future for themselves. And on the West Side, since 1968, when the community erupted in rebellions in response to the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, that wiped out the business district and it never recovered. And so jobs went away. And one of the things that I looked at for this story was the rates of poverty as recorded by the U.S. Census compared to gun homicides last year. And if you look at a map of them, they overlap. The vast majority of gun homicides take place in communities where at least 20% of the people are below the poverty line. And that's what the U.S. Census considers persistent poverty. So folks talked about the need for jobs, and that's something that Brandon Johnson's administration is trying to do with a summer jobs initiative. And that's also something that a lot of these community violence intervention organizations do. They pull people off the street, they give them jobs training, counseling and behavioral health training to deal with the trauma that they've experienced, and train them to get jobs either in the traditional workforce or as community violence interrupters themselves. And a lot of the folks who are doing this work have backgrounds rooted among the very same people that they're trying to now pull off the corners and move forward. The state and city have committed over $100 million to fund those kinds of programs, and Brandon Johnson's Summer Jobs Program and People's Plan for Community Safety have also invested a lot of money, but the city's facing a budget deficit of at least $1 billion. President Trump is pulling funding wherever he can from states and cities that he deems political enemies, and Chicago is definitely in the crosshairs. So whether or not that funding will be available over the long term is it's up in the air right now. This story was part of a larger series that Illinois Answers Project put together called Making It in Chicago, that looked at the barriers and challenges that working class and middle class people face in terms of upward mobility. So on the west side, a lot of it is tied to the lack of divestment and the violence and drug trafficking that happens and depresses the local economy, drives out further investment. But across Chicago, people are struggling, whether they are rideshare drivers, whether they're parents who are having to pay childcare costs that have more than doubled. They've gone up something like 250% over the last 20, 30 years. Folks are struggling with medical debt, student loan debt, and a lot of the programs that offer relief for these sorts of things are out of reach for many of the people who are affected by them. So the overall series looks at all of that, the confluence of that, and how it's impacting regular Chicagoans' economic mobility.
Yeah, we talked with Damian Morris, who is the Chief Program Officer of Violence Prevention at Breakthrough back in March, about the work that he does as a peacekeeper. At the end of the conversation, so much of his focus was trying to secure as much funding to keep these programs going, to keep these programs growing.
One person who I followed through my story is a police district counselor named Brian Ramson. He grew up in New Orleans in poverty. He was educated and became, he's now a neutrino physicist at Fermilab, which is the particle accelerator in the western suburbs. And he moved to the west side because he saw it as a place where he could build wealth. And he bought a 4-flat, fixed it up from scratch, and started renting it out. But he discovered after he bought the property that there was an open-air drug market on his block. He attempted to confront the young man himself, and he wound up in the hospital as a result of that. So what he did then was organized a block club with his neighbors. They got together, and by organizing a block club, which anyone can do for free and they can register it with the city, they were able to not only collectively interface with the city and get attention on their block, but also beautify the block and ultimately push that drug market away. This is something that other block club captains that I've talked to also did. Patty Carrillo in West Humboldt Park has lived there for 20-something years, and they organized a block club to beautify their street and move a similar open-air drug market out. And those sorts of place-based approaches that block club captains and also organizations like Breakthrough, Damian might have talked to you about the park that they have reclaimed for the community. These sorts of approaches are something that the city's also trying in its most violent beats with a Take Back the Block program. And an analysis that we did found that in 4 of the 6 beats where they did this program, violence went down in 2024 compared to the year before, and in only 1 did it go up. And that beat happens to be in one of the census tracts that has the highest poverty in the city. It's something like 73% of residents are below the poverty line. So there's clear ties there, but also the lessons that the city seems to be learning from the people on the front lines and applying are designed to address that very problem.
Chicago, to pat us on the back for a minute, was kind of a pioneer in the community violence intervention space, and the model has really expanded throughout the country. But one of the things that folks have run into both in Chicago and around the US is they started up these programs with different funding streams that came from COVID relief money. And it was a great opportunity for them to launch these programs, but that COVID relief money is drying up. So there's a real risk.
That was always short-lived.
Right.
And a very risky.
Yeah, kind of to Jim's point about people always having to hustle for money. They were able to get these programs up and running and had started to see results. And now that money's drying up. So people are kind of looking around like, oh, okay, well, is there anyone else who can help us with this? Because we want this to keep going because we think it works.
And one thing I would add too is that's COVID relief money that went to programs like, as Nick said, housing and violence reduction. And while that may seem to be unrelated, one of the things many of the people I talked to said was that gun violence, housing are public health issues and should be treated as such. Gun violence is a public health issue, and it has to be approached with a public health framework, not a policing framework, because the goals of those are different.
We will drop links in our show notes to the entire Illinois Answers Project series, Making It in Chicago, Detours and Dead Ends on the Path to Opportunity. Nick, a story one of your colleagues worked on is every year hundreds of people in Cook County file what are called post-conviction petitions, which compile alleged evidence of police misconduct, violations of constitutional rights, or claims of innocence. But accessing these are extremely difficult, and individuals who are incarcerated are not given the same right of attorneys, which make this a difficult process to navigate. Can you talk us through this a little bit?
Yeah, this was a great piece that my colleague Blair Paddock had this week. This is different than sort of an appeal. This is someone who's already been convicted and incarcerated, but they believe that they were wronged. And as the story points out, Chicago has a really high rate of what are later proven to be wrongful convictions. So this is something where, someone who's incarcerated is petitioning the court saying, yeah, any number of things, that I didn't get all the evidence I should have, that I was, I'm innocent of this crime, that I didn't get the help I needed. But they are doing this without the assistance of a lawyer. And for a lot of folks who aren't incarcerated, we don't have the educational background, we don't have the expertise, we don't necessarily have the knowledge of the inner workings of the legal system to understand what exactly makes a strong petition. And some of these may well be legitimate claims, but if they're not presented properly, if there are procedural issues, if they're not backing up these claims, a judge can kick these post-conviction petitions. The other thing is you can file multiple petitions. A judge has to respond to your first one within 90 days. But if it's denied, you can file another one, but it could languish for quite some time. So there are some folks who are pushing to have people who are incarcerated have the right for an attorney to help them. Because it can be everything from, basic barriers in terms of their proficiency with reading and writing to, just the mere fact that the legal system is so complicated. There was a Cook County public defender quoted in the story who estimated that fewer than 5% of cases are successful. But given Chicago's record with wrongful convictions, there are people who want to see folks behind bars get the right to an attorney to help them with this process.
Every single episode of CityCast Chicago ends the exact same way, and that is with some good news. Jim, you want to tell us about a very special opera that is premiering in Chicago next week. What are the details here?
I do. This opera is called She Who Dared. It's playing at the Chicago Opera Theater the week of June 3rd through the 8th, and that's down at the Fine Arts Building on Michigan Avenue. This, I was really excited to read about this. This is the first full-length opera being professionally produced that's written by two Black women, which in and of itself is an amazing thing. Black women have had a history in opera, going back to Marianne Williamson, but they're often given roles as opposed to being put in the driver's seat of productions. And these two women, this is Jasmine Barnes and Deborah Mouton, wrote this opera, which talks about the civil rights movement and the women in the civil rights movement. And it fuses gospel and jazz and blues with classical music. But what's really cool about it, I think, is that the libretto talks about the people who, along with Rosa Parks, refused to give up their seats on buses, did the work of the civil rights movement. I think that a lot of the time when we talk about the civil rights movement, it is boiled down to its leaders. We talk about how Rosa Parks didn't get up because she was tired, when in fact, she was an organizer who was doing this very deliberately as the first salvo in the boycott that desegregated buses. And many people, such as Claudette Colvin, who refused to give up her seat on a bus when she was 15 years old before Rosa Parks launched the boycott. The civil rights movement was not just Dr. King, it was not just Rosa Parks, it was thousands and thousands of ordinary people who put their safety and lives on the line. Some of them were killed, many of them were injured, thousands were jailed to advance civil rights in this country. I think when we discuss history as only being advanced by great leaders like Dr. King or Rosa Parks, it disempowers those of us who actually can make a change in a democracy like ours. And so it's really important for people to see and hear this opera, both because it shows the greatness of Black women who are not only featured in the opera, but who wrote and are performing it. It also highlights the greatness of the American people and the fact that it is on us to save our democracy during the civil rights movement, and again now it's up to ordinary people.
She Who Dared will feature sopranos Jasmine Habersham, Jacqueline Eccles, Lindsay Reynolds, and mezzo-sopranos Krista Williams, Jasmine Olwalia, Leah Dexter, and Sierra Boyd. The conductor is Michael Ingram and director Timothy Douglas, who are making their Chicago Opera Theater debuts. Again, Tuesday, June 3rd, Friday, June 6th, and Sunday, June 8th. We will drop a link in our show notes. And Jim, I really appreciate you putting this on our radar for yet another thing people should be looking forward to this June. Nick, over to you. Chicago has a few film festivals coming up, and you've got a summer-wide festival that you want to put us on.
I love movies. I love going to the movies, but I am by no means like a Criterion Collection cinephile, know everything that's ever made type. But so I need someone to take me by the hand and say, hey, here's a great movie that you probably never heard of. Go check it out. So the Chicago International Film Festival, they have a series of free summer screenings. They start next week on June 2nd. This year's theme is the Summer of Love. So they've got films, a huge array of movies that sort of relate to that theme from countries all across the world. These are free screenings. You got to reserve a ticket in advance, to make sure you get in. They run all through the summer, and they're at a couple really cool venues. They're at the Chicago History Museum and the Chicago Cultural Center, both of which, if you haven't been, very worth checking out, just in general, and also for these screenings.
Mondays and Wednesdays kicking off on June 2nd, running through August. As you said, you got to reserve tickets, and they're released every Monday at 10 a.m. for the following week's films, and the doors open at 5:45. Again, they go fast, so try and stay on top of it. I got a few in here that I think I want to try and pull up for. I'm going to close this out here. I got a very busy weekend coming up. I'm going to start things early Saturday morning over at Northerly Island because I finally have my bird photography class with photographer Jorge Garcia. It's a 2-hour workshop. I've been looking forward to this all month long. And then Saturday night, we are at Park West for Karaoke Storytellers. We got some amazing performers joining us. So if you've ever heard of Karaoke Storytellers, or even if you haven't, you can pull up. You can tell a 5-10 minute story, true story about your life, whatever you want to talk about, and the singer related karaoke song. We are bringing 2 people on stage to do it at the event. So we'd love to have y'all. And then on Sunday, I am excited to be sitting down with Ayanna Contreras to be talking about the history of Chicago gospel music. Shout out to all of the people who have, kind of helped me prepare and brought that opportunity my way. So got a packed weekend, really excited to get out and around Chicago this weekend. Before I get started with my weekend, I want to make sure I thank our guests. So shout out to Southside Weekly's investigation editor, Jim Daly. Jim, always good to see you.
Likewise. Thanks so much for having me on.
And from WTTW correspondent and host, Nick Blumberg. Nick, thank you for joining the podcast.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Please join me in thanking the people who make CityCast Chicago possible. That includes our executive producer, Simone Alicea. Our producer is Michelle Navarro. Our Hey Chicago newsletter editor, Emmy Mack. Our social media manager, Rick Homuth. The music we all love is from Sam Thousand, All the Kimonos, and Mark Greenberg from the Mayfair Workshop. Additional music this week from House of Say, courtesy of EpidemicSound.com. Hey, if you enjoy the podcast or the newsletter, then do me one big favor. Keep sharing it with the people in your life, your friends, your family, your coworkers, the people you pass on the bus and the train. Maybe you got a tote bag, show it off. Maybe you got a mug, take a picture. In the meantime, in between time, follow us on Instagram, on TikTok, and be back here bright and early next week. We'll talk to you on Monday or whenever the hell you listen. Peace.